Jake Morrison pressed his face against the small window of the transport ship and watched the massive space station grow larger. Nexus Academy looked like a giant metal flower floating in the darkness of space. Hundreds of lights blinked across its surface, and ships of all shapes and sizes moved around it like busy insects. The pilot, a blue-skinned alien with 4 arms, turned to look at Jake. "First time seeing the Academy, human?" "Yeah," Jake said, his voice full of excitement. "It's huge. Biggest school in the galaxy. You sure you want to do this? Most species send their students here after years of preparation. Your people just decided to throw you in the deep end." Jake shrugged. "Humans like challenges." The pilot made a sound that might have been laughter. "I heard that about your kind. They say you come from a death world." "Earth isn't that bad," Jake replied. "We just have some interesting weather." 20 minutes later, Jake walked through the docking bay carrying his single bag. The air tasted different here, cleaner somehow, and gravity felt lighter under his feet. Aliens of every shape and size moved around him. Some looked almost human except for strange skin colors or extra limbs. Others were completely different, like the creature that looked like a walking tree or the one that seemed to be made of living crystal. A tall, thin alien with gray skin and large black eyes approached him. She wore the blue uniform that marked her as Academy staff. "You must be Jake Morrison, the human exchange student. I am Counselor Vex. Welcome to Nexus Academy." "Thanks," Jake said, adjusting his bag on his shoulder. "This place is amazing." "Yes, it is home to over 50,000 students from 200 different species. You will find it quite different from your world." Counselor Vex started walking, and Jake followed her through the busy corridors. "I must warn you, some students may react strangely to your presence." "Because I'm human?" "Because you are from what we classify as a Category 9 death world. Most inhabited planets are Category 2 or 3. Earth is considered one of the most dangerous planets in known space." Jake laughed. "Really? It's not that scary once you get used to it." Counselor Vex stopped walking and stared at him. "Your planet has predatory animals that hunt in packs, weather systems that can destroy entire cities, and plant life that produces deadly toxins. The fact that your species not only survived but became the dominant life form is considered remarkable by galactic standards. When you put it like that, I guess we are pretty tough," Jake said. They continued through the academy. Jake saw classrooms, filled with students who looked nothing like him, laboratories with equipment he couldn't begin to understand, and libraries that stretched as far as he could see. Everything was built on a massive scale to accommodate species of different sizes. His dormitory room was on level 47, in a section reserved for students who needed Earth-like atmosphere. Jake's roommate was already there when he arrived. The mime alien looked like a living piece of blue crystal that hummed softly when it moved. "You must be Jake," the crystal being said, its voice sounding like musical notes. "I am Zix. I am from the Vorthak homeworld." "Nice to meet you," Jake said, setting his bag on the empty bed. "Hope you don't mind having a human roommate." Zix's crystal body flickered with different colors. "I admit I am nervous. I have never met a Deathworlder before. Is it true that you sleep in complete darkness?" "Most humans do, yeah." "Is that a problem?" "My species requires constant light to maintain our crystalline structure. Perhaps we can find a compromise." Jake unpacked his few belongings while Zix watched with fascination. When Jake pulled out a bottle of hot sauce, Zix backed away quickly. "What is that red liquid?" Zix asked, his crystal form dimming with concern. "Hot sauce. I put it on my food to make it taste better." "You consume chemical irritants for pleasure?" "It's not that bad. Want to try some?" "No." Zix's voice hit a high note that made the windows vibrate. "I have read about human dietary habits. You eat plants that evolve to be poisonous and call them spices. You consume the fermented milk of other species. You even eat the reproductive organs of plants and consider them delicacies." Jake paused with an apple in his hand. "When you describe it like that, it does sound pretty weird." The next few days were full of new experiences. Jake attended his first universal biology class, taught by Professor Quilm, who looked like a giant octopus with too many tentacles. Most of the other students gave Jake a wide berth, whispering among themselves whenever he passed. In the dining hall, Jake learned that human food was considered exotic and dangerous by most species. The cafeteria had to special order ingredients that wouldn't kill him, while other students ate what looked like colored paste or glowing liquids. "You actually enjoy consuming dead animal flesh?" asked Kayla, an Etherian student whose skin glowed with soft patterns of light. She sat across from Jake during lunch, apparently fascinated by his eating habits. "Meat is pretty normal on Earth," Jake said between bites of his sandwich. "Most humans eat it. On my world, all life forms photosynthesize. We gain energy directly from our sun. The idea of consuming another living being is disturbing." Jake thought about this while he chewed. "I guess different worlds develop different survival strategies." "Survival," Kayla repeated, her light patterns shifting to yellow. "That word comes up often when discussing humans. Your species seems obsessed with it." "Not obsessed," Jake said. "We just had to get good at it. Earth threw a lot of challenges at us over the years." During his first week, Jake discovered that his casual attitude toward danger made his classmates uncomfortable. When a small fire started in the chemistry lab, other students panicked and ran for the exits. Jake simply grabbed a fire extinguisher and put it out, then went back to his experiment. "How are you so calm?" Zix asked later. "Fire is one of the most destructive forces in the universe. Fire isn't that bad if you know how to handle it," Jake replied. "Humans have been using fire for thousands of years. It's actually pretty useful." The breaking point came during his second week when Professor Quilm assigned the semester project. Each student had to research and present on a dangerous creature from the galactic database. The assignment was meant to teach students about xenobiology, while keeping them safely in the classroom. Jake scrolled through the database on his tablet, looking at the different entries. Most of his classmates chose creatures that were well documented and safely contained in research facilities. There were acid-spitting insects, predatory fish with razor teeth, and plants that could strangle prey with their vines. Then Jake found something interesting. Entry X7749, labeled as Unclassified Hostile Entity. The description was brief and mostly redacted, but Jake could see it had been responsible for multiple research team casualties. The few surviving reports described it as highly intelligent and extremely dangerous. "This looks interesting," Jake said to himself, clicking on the entry. Zix looked over his shoulder and immediately began flashing bright warning colors. "Jake, no. You cannot choose that creature." "Why not? It says here it's unclassified. That means there's still a lot to learn about it. It also says it has killed every research team sent to study it." Jake shrugged. "All the good discoveries involve some risk." Word spread quickly through the dormitory that the human had chosen to study the most dangerous creature in the database. Students began avoiding Jake even more, and some requested room transfers. Even the faculty seemed nervous when they heard about his choice. But Jake was excited. Finally, he had found something at Nexus Academy that felt like a real challenge. He had no idea that his simple homework assignment was about to change everything. Jake spent the next 3 days digging through the Academy's database, trying to learn more about creature X7749. The more he read, the more interested he became. The official reports were mostly blacked out, but he could piece together bits of information from different sources. The creature had first been discovered on a remote moon in the outer rim. The initial survey team had landed, set up their equipment, and then simply vanished. When the rescue team arrived a week later, they found the camp destroyed and strange readings on their instruments. No bodies were ever recovered. The second expedition was military. They brought weapons, armor, and enough firepower to level a small city. 3 days after landing, their communications went dead. The orbital command ship waited 2 weeks before sending down a third team. They found the military equipment scattered across the moon's surface, but again, no bodies. Jake pulled up the survivor reports. Only 5 beings in the past 50 years had encountered X7749 and lived to tell about it. Their accounts were brief and often contradictory, but they all mentioned the same things. The creature was huge, moved like living shadow, and seemed to appear and disappear at will. Most disturbing of all, it appeared to be intelligent. "The thing looked at me," wrote Commander Voth of the 3rd Hegemony Fleet. "Not like an animal looks at prey, but like it was studying me. Like I was an interesting puzzle it wanted to solve. I have fought in 47 battles across known space, but nothing has ever made me feel so small and helpless." Jake found this fascinating rather than frightening. An intelligent creature that could move between dimensions and had survived multiple military strikes? That was the kind of discovery that could change everything scientists knew about biology and physics. His enthusiasm was not shared by his classmates. When word got out about his research topic, Zix stopped speaking to him entirely. The crystal being would come into their room, flash worried yellow colors, and leave again without saying anything. Other students in the hallway would literally cross to the other side when they saw Jake coming. Keela was the only one brave enough to approach him directly. She found him in the library 3 days after he had chosen his topic, surrounded by stacks of data tablets and research files. "Jake," she said, her bioluminescent patterns pulsing with concern, "you need to choose a different creature for your project." "Why?" Jake asked, not looking up from his reading. "This is the most interesting thing I've found since I got here." "Because X7749 is classified as an extinction class threat. Do you understand what that means?" Jake finally looked up. "Something that could wipe out a whole species?" "Not just a species, a civilization. There are only 12 creatures in the known galaxy with that classification. Most of them are contained in special facilities or trapped on quarantined worlds. X7749 is the only one that remains completely free." "That makes it even more interesting," Jake said. "If it's so dangerous, why hasn't anyone figured out how to communicate with it? Maybe it's not actually hostile. Maybe it's just misunderstood." Kayla's light patterns shifted to deep red, which Jake had learned meant extreme distress. "Jake, this creature has killed hundreds of researchers, soldiers, and explorers. It doesn't communicate, it destroys." "But look at this," Jake said, pulling up a file on his tablet. "All the attacks happened when people tried to capture it or set up permanent research stations in its territory. What if it's just defending itself?" "You're thinking like a human," Kayla said. "Not everything in the universe can be reasoned with or befriended." Jake shrugged. "Maybe not, but I won't know until I try to understand it better." The conversation ended when Professor Quilm's assistant approached their table. The small, bug-like alien's wings buzzed nervously as it delivered the message. "Student Morrison, Professor Quilm requests your immediate presence in his office." Jake packed up his research materials and followed the assistant through the academy's winding corridors. Professor Quilm's office was a large, dimly lit room, filled with specimens from across the galaxy. Creatures that looked like living plants shared shelf space with crystallized insects, and things Jake couldn't even begin to identify. Professor Quilm was waiting behind his desk, all 8 of his tentacles writhing with what Jake had learned to recognize as extreme agitation. The professor was normally calm and professional, but today he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Jake, my boy, please sit down," Professor Quilm said, gesturing to a chair with 2 of his tentacles while the others continued their anxious movement. "Is this about my research topic?" Jake asked as he settled into the chair. "Indeed it is. I must ask you to reconsider your choice. X7749 is not a suitable subject for a student project. But Professor, you said we should choose something that challenged us and expanded our understanding of xenobiology. This creature could teach us things we never imagined." Professor Quilm's tentacles went still for a moment, then began moving, even faster. "Jake, do you understand what happened to the last research team that studied this creature? The reports are mostly classified, but I know they didn't make it back. They were the finest xenobiologists in the galaxy. Dr. Thesson had studied dangerous creatures for 40 years. Commander Yix had military training and enough firepower to destroy a small asteroid. Professor Whelm was a psychic specialist who could communicate with any intelligent species." Professor Quilm paused, his tentacles coiling around themselves. "X7749 killed them all in less than 6 hours. Jake leaned forward in his chair. "But how do we know it actually killed them? Maybe they just disappeared." Maybe the creature transported them somewhere else. Because we found pieces, Professor, Quilm said quietly. Very small pieces. The room fell silent. Jake could hear the soft humming of the environmental systems and the distant sounds of students in the hallway. He thought about what the professor had said, trying to imagine what could have happened to those researchers. I still want to study it, Jake said finally. Professor Quilm's tentacles stopped moving entirely. I beg your pardon? I want to study X7749. I know it's dangerous, but that's exactly why someone needs to understand it better. What if there's a way to communicate with it? What if all those deaths could have been prevented if someone had approached it differently? Jake, this creature is not some misunderstood animal that needs a friend. It is a force of destruction that has puzzled the greatest minds in the galaxy. Then maybe it needs a different kind of mind looking at it, Jake said. Maybe it needs someone who doesn't assume it's evil just because it's dangerous. Professor, Quilm stared at Jake for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a stack of forms. If you insist on pursuing this madness, you will need to sign these liability waivers. The Academy will not be responsible for any psychological damage, physical harm, or existential crisis that may result from your research. Jake looked through the forms. There were warnings about mental contamination, reality distortion, and something called dimensional displacement syndrome. The final form was titled, Acknowledgement of Probable Death or Worse. I'll sign them, Jake said. You will also be required to attend daily psychological evaluations and submit all research notes for review by the Safety Committee. That's fine. Professor Quilm's tentacles began their nervous writhing again. Jake, I have been teaching for over 200 years. I have seen students from every major species in the galaxy, but I have never met anyone who approached certain death with such casual enthusiasm. It's not certain death, Jake said, signing the last form. It's just a research project. Those may be the same thing in this case. Jake handed back the signed forms and stood up. Don't worry, Professor. I'll be careful. As Jake left the office, Professor Quilm watched him go with a mixture of admiration and horror. The human student walked down the hallway like he was going to study for a simple biology test, not research one of the most dangerous entities in known space. Professor Quilm made a note in Jake's file. Student displays typical human disregard for personal safety. Recommend increased psychological monitoring and preparation of memorial services. Meanwhile, Jake returned to the library, excited to continue his research. He had no idea that his casual approach to cosmic horror was already becoming legendary among the Academy's faculty. By the end of the week, his name would be known throughout the station as either the bravest student who had ever lived or the craziest. 3 weeks into his research, Jake finally got permission to visit the restricted xenobiology lab. The Academy kept their most dangerous specimens there, behind layers of security that most students never even saw. Jake needed to examine some biological samples that had been recovered from X7749's territory on the remote moon. The restricted lab was located deep in the Academy's lower levels, past multiple security checkpoints and blast doors. Jake had to submit to 3 different scans and provide voice, retinal, and genetic identification before the final door opened with a heavy thud. Inside, the lab looked like something from a science fiction movie. Rows of containment units lined the walls, each one holding specimens that could kill or drive insane anyone foolish enough to get too close. Warning lights blinked on most of the containers, and several had signs in multiple languages that all basically said, "Do not touch, under any circumstances." Dr. Vex, the lab supervisor, met Jake at the entrance. She was a hegemony scientist with 4 arms and skin that changed color based on her mood. Right now, her skin was a nervous purple color. "Student Morrison," she said, checking her clipboard, with 2 hands while the other 2 gestured at the lab. "I must say, your request to examine X7749 materials is highly unusual. Most students prefer to study creatures that won't give them nightmares." "I don't get nightmares easily," Jake said, looking around at the various containment units with interest rather than fear. Dr. Vex's skin shifted to a deeper purple. "Yes, I've heard about human sleep patterns. Voluntary unconsciousness in complete darkness. Quite disturbing, really. She led Jake to a workstation in the center of the lab. On the table were several small containers holding what looked like pieces of black fabric. Next to them were data readers showing environmental scans and energy measurements. These samples were recovered from the moon's surface after the last research expedition, Dr. Vex explained. They appear to be shed skin, or possibly dimensional, residue left behind by the creature. We're not entirely sure what they are. Jake put on the protective gloves and picked up one of the containers. The material inside looked like a piece of night sky that had been cut out and preserved. It seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making it difficult to focus on. Interesting, Jake said, turning the container to examine it from different angles. It doesn't look organic. Our analysis suggests it exists partially in normal space and partially in what we call shadow dimensions. The quantum structure is unlike anything we've encountered before. Jake spent the next 2 hours examining the samples and reading the environmental data. The energy readings were strange, showing patterns that didn't match any known life form. But there was something familiar about them that Jake couldn't quite identify. Dr. Vex, Jake said, looking up from the data reader. Do these energy patterns remind you of anything? They're completely unique in our database. Why do you ask? I don't know. There's something about the way they pulse that seems familiar. Dr. Vex's skin shifted to yellow, which Jake had learned meant confusion or concern. Student Morrison, I hope you're not suggesting that humans have encountered similar entities. No, nothing like that. It just reminds me of something, but I can't remember what. Jake was so focused on his work that he didn't notice when Dr. Vex left to attend to other duties. The lab grew quiet except for the soft humming of the containment units and the occasional beep from monitoring equipment. Jake continued studying the samples, making notes on his tablet and cross-referencing the data with his earlier research. Around midnight, the main lights in the lab suddenly went out. Emergency power kicked in a few seconds later, bathing everything in dim red light that made the shadows seem deeper and more threatening. Jake looked up from his work expecting to see Dr. Vex returning to check on the power failure. Instead, he saw something moving in the corner of his vision. At first, he thought it was just his eyes adjusting to the different lighting. Then he realized that one of the shadows near the back wall was moving independently of the others. Jake set down his tablet and watched the shadow with the same calm attention he might give to an interesting bird outside his window. The shadow seemed to notice his attention and stopped moving. Well, that's new, Jake said to himself. The shadow began to take shape, growing taller and more defined. Within moments, it had formed into something that looked like a person made of living darkness. Eyes like distant stars opened in what might have been its head, and it regarded Jake with what seemed like curiosity. Most beings who encountered X7749 reported overwhelming terror, confusion, and an immediate desire to flee or hide. Jake felt mildly interested and slightly concerned about lab safety protocols. You're not supposed to be here, Jake said, speaking to the shadow creature like he might address a lost student who had wandered into the wrong classroom. The creature tilted its head, which Jake took as a sign that it understood him. It moved closer, and Jake could feel a strange, tingling sensation, like the air before a thunderstorm. But instead of fear, he felt the same cautious curiosity he might have when meeting a large dog of unknown temperament. You're X7749, aren't you? Jake said. I've been studying you for my homework assignment. The creature stopped moving and seemed to consider this information. Then it approached Jake's workstation, moving with a fluid grace that was almost hypnotic to watch. Jake picked up his tablet and showed it to the creature. Want to see what I've learned so far? The shadow being leaned closer, and Jake could see that it was examining the screen with genuine interest. He scrolled through his research notes, explaining his theories about the creature's behavior and possible motivations. I think you're not actually trying to hurt anyone, Jake said conversationally. I think you're just defending yourself when people try to capture you or invade your space. Am I right? The creature reached out with what might have been a hand and gently touched the tablet screen. Where it made contact, new information appeared. Complex diagrams and mathematical equations that Jake didn't recognize but somehow found beautiful. For the next hour, Jake and the creature engaged in the strangest study session in galactic history. The being would show Jake new information, on the tablet, and Jake would ask questions or offer his own observations. It was like having a conversation with someone who spoke a completely different language, but somehow they were managing to communicate. Jake learned that the creature wasn't from the moon where it had been discovered. It was from somewhere else, entirely, a place that existed between the normal dimensions that most species knew about. It had come to the moon to study the life forms that visited there, but every time it tried to make contact, the visitors would panic and attack. "So you're a researcher too," Jake said, understanding dawning on his face. "You're trying to study us the same way we're trying to study you." The creature's star-like eyes seemed to brighten, and it touched Jake's shoulder with surprising gentleness. The contact felt warm and somehow grateful. When the regular lights came back on, the creature began to fade away, but before it disappeared completely, it touched the tablet one more time. A single symbol appeared on the screen, something that looked like a mathematical equation combined with a written language Jake had never seen before. "Is that your name?" Jake asked. The creature nodded once, then vanished completely, leaving Jake alone in the lab with a tablet full of impossible information and the growing realization that he had just made first contact with an interdimensional being. Jake looked around the empty lab, then down at his tablet. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting when he tried to explain this to Professor Quilm. He had a feeling that his homework assignment was about to become much more complicated. Jake woke up the next morning to the sound of emergency alarms echoing through the academy. Red lights flashed in the hallways, and automated voices announced that all students should remain in their quarters until further notice. Jake sat up, in bed, wondering what could have caused such a panic. Zix was already awake, his crystal form flickering between different colors rapidly. This was something Jake had learned meant extreme distress in Vorthak body language. "Jake," Zix said, his musical voice hitting several worried notes at once. "Something terrible has happened. The security systems detected an unauthorized presence in the restricted lab last night." "Really?" Jake said, trying to sound surprised. "What kind of presence?" "The kind that kills research teams and destroys military expeditions," Zix replied. "They're saying X7749 somehow got inside the academy." Jake got dressed quickly while Zix continued to flash anxious colors. Outside their room, they could hear other students talking in hushed, frightened voices. Some were crying, others were demanding to be transferred to safer schools, and a few were packing their belongings as if they planned to leave immediately. 20. Minutes later, Professor Quilm burst through their door without knocking. The professor's tentacles were writhing so violently that he looked like he was having some kind of seizure. Behind him came Dr. Vex, and two medical technicians carrying what looked like scanning equipment. "Jake, my boy," Professor Quilm said, his voice shaking. "How are you feeling this morning? Any confusion, terror, existential dread, or desire to harm yourself or others?" "I feel fine, Professor," Jake said, sitting on his bed. "Why are you asking?" "Because the security footage shows that you were in the restricted lab when the creature appeared. We expected to find you in a catatonic state or worse." Jake looked confused. "What creature?" Professor Quilm's tentacles went completely still, which Jake had learned was a very bad sign. "Jake, you were alone in the lab with X7749 for over an hour. The most dangerous entity in known space was in the same room with you. How are you not dead or insane?" "Oh, you mean my study partner?" Jake said casually. "Yeah, he showed up to help with my research. Pretty nice guy once you get to know him." The medical technicians dropped their equipment. Dr. Vex turned a color that Jake had never seen before, somewhere between purple and green. Professor Quilm made a sound like air being let out of a balloon and then fainted, all 8 of his tentacles going limp at once. "Study partner?" Dr. Vex whispered. "Yeah," Jake said, pulling out his tablet to show her the new information. "Look at all this data he shared with me. I think I understand what he is now." Dr. Vex stared at the tablet screen, her skin cycling through colors so fast it looked like a rainbow. The equations and diagrams were beyond anything in the Academy's database. Some of the mathematics looked like it described reality in ways that shouldn't be possible. "Jake," she said slowly, "this information suggests that the creature exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The mathematical models here are centuries ahead of our current understanding of physics. I know, right? Jake said excitedly. He's incredibly smart. I think he's been trying to study us the same way we've been trying to study him. One of the medical technicians was trying to revive Professor Quilm by fanning him with a clipboard. The other was scanning Jake with a device that kept making confused beeping sounds. The scanner says he's completely normal, the technician reported. No signs of mental contamination, reality distortion, or dimensional displacement. It's like he had a pleasant conversation instead of encountering cosmic horror. Because I did have a pleasant conversation, Jake said. He's not trying to hurt anyone. He's just curious about other life forms. Dr. Vex sat down heavily in a chair. Jake, this creature has killed hundreds of researchers and soldiers. Military fleets have tried to destroy it and failed. How did you manage to communicate with it? I talked to him like he was intelligent instead of assuming he was a monster, Jake said. Turns out that makes a big difference. Professor Quilm finally woke up and immediately tried to sit up. Did I dream that the human made friends with X7749? You did not dream it, Dr. Vex said. Professor Quilm fainted again. Within an hour, word of Jake's encounter had spread throughout the academy. Director Thane, the station's commanding officer, arrived with a full security team. He was a tall, imposing hegemony official with scales instead of skin and eyes like yellow diamonds. Student Morrison, Director Thane said, his voice echoing through the small dorm room. You will come with us immediately. Am I in trouble? Jake asked. That depends on whether you've been compromised by an alien intelligence or have somehow accomplished the impossible. Jake packed his tablet and followed the security team through corridors filled with staring students and terrified faculty. They brought him to a secure conference room deep in the academy's administrative section. The walls were lined with sensors and recording equipment, and Jake counted at least 6 different types of scanning devices pointed at the chair where they told him to sit. Director Thane sat across from him at a metal table. Jake Morrison, you are either the luckiest student in galactic history or the most dangerous. We need to determine which. I don't feel dangerous, Jake said. That's what makes this situation so concerning. Director Thane activated a recording device. Tell me exactly what happened in the restricted lab. Jake spent the next 2 hours describing his encounter with X7749. He explained how the creature had appeared, how they had communicated through the tablet, and how it had shared advanced mathematical concepts with him. The more he talked, the more agitated the director became. You're telling me that you treated a class extinction threat like a study group partner? Well, yeah. He was helping me with my homework. Director Thane stood up and began pacing around the room. Jake, do you understand that this creature has destroyed entire research expeditions? Seasoned military veterans have been reduced to gibbering madness just from seeing it. Maybe they approached it wrong, Jake said. If someone pointed weapons at me and tried to capture me, I'd probably defend myself too. Are you suggesting that all previous encounters with X7749 were the result of human error? Not human error. Everyone else error. Humans weren't involved in those expeditions. Director Thane stopped pacing and stared at Jake. What makes humans different? Jake thought about this for a moment. We're curious instead of scared, I guess. When we see something we don't understand, we want to learn about it. Other species seem to assume that different means dangerous. Different usually does mean dangerous. Maybe for other species. But humans come from a world where we had to deal with dangerous things every day. We learned that understanding something is usually safer than running away from it. Director Thane sat back down and studied Jake carefully. The creature gave you advanced mathematical formulas. Do you understand what they mean? Not really, but I'd like to learn. Maybe he could teach me more if we met again. Absolutely not, Director Thane said quickly. You will not have any further contact with X7749. This academy cannot risk. He was interrupted by an aide who rushed into the room and whispered something in his ear. Director Thane's scaled face went pale. What do you mean it's back? He said. The aide pointed at a wall screen that had just activated. It showed the main auditorium, where Jake's presentation was scheduled for tomorrow. Sitting in the front, row, as solid and real as any student, was X7749. It appears to be waiting for something, the aide said. Director Thane looked at Jake, then at the screen, then back at Jake. Student Morrison, I believe your study partner wants to attend your presentation. Jake smiled. That's great. I was hoping he'd show up. I have some questions I wanted to ask him. Director Thane put his head in his hands. This is either the greatest breakthrough in interspecies communication or the beginning of the end of galactic civilization. Probably both, Jake said cheerfully. The Academy's main auditorium had never been so full. Word about Jake's encounter with X7749 had spread beyond the station, and beings from across the galaxy had come to witness what might be the most important presentation in galactic history. Scientists, military officials, diplomats, and journalists packed every seat. Jake stood backstage checking his notes one final time. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see the audience. Most of them looked terrified. Security forces lined the walls, though everyone knew their weapons would be useless against X7749. Psychic barriers had been erected around the auditorium, but those were more to contain panic than to stop an interdimensional being. Jake, Professor Quilm said, approaching with his tentacles coiled nervously around himself. Are you certain about this? We could postpone the presentation until we understand the situation better. It'll be fine, Professor, Jake said. He's just here to help with my homework. That creature sitting in the front row has killed more researchers than any other entity in known space. That was before anyone tried talking to him properly, Jake replied. Director Thane appeared beside them, his scaled face grim. Student Morrison, if this presentation goes wrong, it could mean the end of the Academy, possibly the end of this sector of space. No pressure then, Jake said with a smile. The lights in the auditorium dimmed, and Jake walked onto the stage. The audience fell completely silent. Even the security forces stopped moving. In the front row, X7749 sat perfectly still, its star-like eyes focused on Jake. Good afternoon, everyone, Jake said, his voice echoing through the sound system. My presentation today is titled X7749, Misunderstood Apex Predator or Interdimensional Researcher? A wave of nervous whispers ran through the audience. Several beings in the back rows stood up to leave, but the exits had been sealed for security reasons. Jake activated the main display screen and began his presentation. For the past month, I've been studying the entity known as X7749. Most reports describe it as a hostile creature that attacks without provocation. But I think we've been looking at this all wrong. He clicked to his first slide, which showed a timeline of all the encounters with X7749. If you look at the pattern of incidents, you'll notice something interesting. The creature never attacks first. It only responds to aggressive actions taken against it. Jake walked closer to the audience, gesturing toward X7749. Think about it from his perspective. You're trying to study other life forms, but every time you approach them, they start shooting at you or trying to capture you. Wouldn't you defend yourself? Dr. Vex, sitting in the third row, raised one of her 4 hands. Student Morrison, are you suggesting that X7749 is conducting research? I'm not suggesting it, Jake said. I'm stating it as fact. He told me so himself. The auditorium erupted in shocked voices. Security teams tightened their grips on their weapons. Director Thane looked like he was having trouble breathing. You communicated with it? Shouted Commander Voth from the Hegemony military section. We had a conversation, Jake said calmly. Well, more like a study session. He's incredibly intelligent and eager to share knowledge. Jake turned to X7749. Would you like to show them some of your research? The shadow being stood up slowly. Half the audience immediately fainted or tried to climb over each other to reach the exits. The other half sat frozen in terror. X7749 moved toward the stage with fluid grace, and Jake could hear several beings whisper prayers in their native languages. But instead of attacking, X7749 approached Jake's presentation. Tablet. Where it touched the device, new information appeared on the main screen. Complex equations and diagrams that made some of the Academy's top scientists gasp in recognition. These are dimensional mathematics, Professor Quilm whispered from the front row. Theoretical frameworks we've been trying to develop for centuries. Jake nodded. He comes from a place that exists between our normal dimensions. His species has been studying three-dimensional life forms for thousands of years, but we keep attacking them before they can make proper contact. X7749 continued to interface with the tablet, and more information appeared. Star charts showing previously unknown systems, biological data about species that lived in dimensional folds, and mathematical proofs that solved physics problems scientists had worked on for generations. He's not trying to hurt us, Jake continued. He's trying to teach us. Every encounter that ended in violence happened because we approached him as a threat instead of as a fellow researcher. Keela, sitting near the middle of the auditorium, raised her hand. Her bioluminescent patterns were pulsing with amazement rather than fear. How do we know we can trust it? Jake looked at X7749, who had finished uploading information and returned to its seat. Because he had plenty of chances to hurt me and he didn't. Because he shared advanced knowledge freely. And because right now, he's sitting quietly in an auditorium full of beings who have tried to kill him, and he's not fighting back. The audience began to murmur among themselves. Jake could see that some of them were starting to understand. The fear in the room was slowly being replaced by curiosity and wonder. The creature in the front row could probably destroy this entire station if it wanted to, Jake said. Instead, it chose to attend a student presentation to help me explain interdimensional physics to my classmates. Commander Voth stood up from his seat. If this entity is truly peaceful, why didn't it try to communicate before? Why did it kill so many of our people? X7749 turned to look at the commander, and Jake could swear he saw sadness in those star-filled eyes. Because nobody ever gave him a chance, Jake said. Every first contact attempt started with weapons and capture equipment. Imagine if aliens landed on Earth and immediately started shooting. How do you think humans would respond? The commander sat back down, looking thoughtful. Jake spent the next hour explaining X7749's true nature. The being was part of an ancient species that existed across multiple dimensions. They had been trying to study and understand three-dimensional life for millennia, but most species reacted to them with fear and violence. X7749 had been assigned to research the various species that visited the remote moon, but every expedition that found him treated him as a threat. He's basically a graduate student working on his thesis, Jake concluded, and his thesis is about understanding how three-dimensional beings think and behave. When Jake finished his presentation, the auditorium was completely silent. Then, slowly, Professor Quilm began to clap. Dr. Vex joined him, then Keela, then other students and faculty. Soon the entire auditorium was applauding. X7749 stood up and approached the stage once more. This time only a few beings showed any fear. The entity touched Jake's shoulder gently, then turned to face the audience. It made a gesture that somehow conveyed gratitude and respect. Director Thane took the stage. Student Morrison, this is the most remarkable presentation in the Academy's history. You have not only made first contact with an interdimensional species, but you've established the foundation for ongoing diplomatic relations. Jake grinned. Does this mean I get an A on the assignment? You get the highest grade in Academy records, Professor Quilm said, and probably a few academic awards. As the audience began to file out, chattering excitedly about what they had witnessed, Jake remained on stage with X7749. The being projected new information onto his tablet, and Jake realized it was something like contact information for other members of its species. So this is just the beginning, Jake said. X7749 nodded, and Jake could swear it was smiling despite not having a visible mouth. Later that evening, Jake sat in his dorm room, video calling his family on Earth. Zix was nearby, his crystal form glowing with happy colors as he processed the day's events. So how's school going, honey? Jake's mother asked from the screen. Pretty good, Jake said. I made a new friend who's helping me with my science homework. That's nice, dear. What's he like? Jake glanced over at X7749, who was sitting in the corner of the room, quietly reading one of Jake's textbooks with apparent fascination. He's really smart, Jake said, and he's from out of town. Well, make sure you're eating enough vegetables, his mother said, and don't stay up too late studying. I won't, Mom. As Jake ended the call, he reflected on how much his life had changed. A month ago, he was just another exchange student trying to fit in at an alien academy. Now he was the galaxy's first human ambassador to an interdimensional species, and his homework partner was the most feared entity in known space. It was, Jake thought, exactly the kind of adventure he had hoped for when he applied to study among the stars. The fact that it had started as a simple research project just made it more satisfying. Humans, he decided, really were pretty good at making friends with the impossible,